It started with a whisper, like all bad ideas do. The whisper was a legend, passed down from drunken sailors in shadowy bars, their eyes too haunted to be lying. They spoke of a ship, a ghostly relic that sailed the waters every Halloween night, cutting through the fog like a blade. No crew, they said, just bones. Clattering, fleshless bones with hollow eyes and an insatiable hunger for what they'd lost centuries ago. Gold. We laughed when we first heard it. Of course we did. The kind of nervous laughter that fills a room when no one wants to admit they're spooked. It was me, Brian, Max, and Cole. We were treasure hunters. Not professionals, mind you, but eager enough to chase any rumor that came our way. And this rumor? It had teeth. The promise of a fortune buried in the belly of a cursed pirate ship. How could we resist? It's just a story, Max had said, but there was a tightness in his voice. People make stuff up all the time to keep amateurs like us away. But Brian was always the one who took it a step further. He didn't care about the warnings, the mutterings of the old-timers. He saw only the gold. We set sail tomorrow night, he said, his voice too steady, too confident. We'll find it, and we'll be rich. I wish I'd said no. We left the dock just as the sun dipped below the horizon, dragging its bloody orange light down with it. By the time the moon replaced it, swollen and pale, we were alone on the water. The mist rolled in thick, coiling around our small boat like smoke, and the sea grew oddly still, like it was holding its breath. That's when the cold set in, the kind that seeps into your bones, even though it was a warm autumn night. Brian stood at the wheel, staring into the nothing ahead of us, his face set like stone. Max was below deck, checking the gear, and Cole sat across from me, his knee bouncing with nervous energy. Then out of nowhere there was a sound, a scraping like nails dragged across a chalkboard. We all froze, eyes wide, listening. The boat rocked gently, just enough to set our nerves on edge. What was that? Cole whispered, his voice barely audible. Probably just... But Brian's answer was cut short by another sound, this one louder, closer. Thump. Max popped his head out from below deck, his face pale. Did you hear that? Yeah, I muttered, standing up. My hands were shaking, but I told myself it was the cold. Thump. And louder this time. We all turned in unison toward the starboard side, where the mist seemed to grow thicker, darker, like it was swallowing something whole. The air felt heavy, suffocating, and then, out of the fog, it came. A ship. It was massive, towering over us with its blackened hull slick with algae and age. Tattered sails flapped weakly in the wind, but it was moving fast, too fast for something so ancient. The name was barely visible along the side, its letters worn down by centuries of decay. The Revenant. None of us spoke. We just stared, too stunned to react. The ship was close enough now that we could see the deck, see the movement. Bones. They were everywhere. Moving, shifting, as if held together by some unseen force. A skeletal crew, silent and relentless, preparing their ghostly ship for God knows what. I watched in horror as one of them turned its eyeless skull toward us. It tilted its head, almost curious, and then raised a bony hand, pointing directly at me. And that's when the screaming started. Max was the first to lose it. He bolted for the controls, fumbling with the engine as the mist thickened around us, obscuring the skeletal figures on the ship. The sound of clattering bones grew louder, closer, like they were swarming us. I felt something cold brush against my arm, just a shadow, I told myself. Just, get us out of here! Brian yelled, but Max couldn't get the engine to turn over. The air was filled with the grinding of bone on wood, the scraping of nails, and the sound of something dragging itself across the deck. Then I saw it climbing up from the water. Its skull gleamed in the moonlight, dark and slick, empty sockets fixed on me. Bony hands clawed their way up the side of our boat, and then it rose, towering over me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It opened its jaw, and though no voice came out, I could hear it in my head, a low, rumbling growl that filled my mind with images I can't shake. Fire, screaming, death, and gold, piles of it glinting under the blood-red sun. Suddenly, the thing lunged at me, its fingers curling around my throat. The bones felt real, solid, impossibly strong, and I choked, gasping for breath. I heard Cole shouting, felt hands pulling me back, but my vision was going dark. And then, just as quickly as it had grabbed me, it was gone, pulled back into the mist along with the ship. The Revenant vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving us adrift in the silence. No one said a word. We just sat there, staring at the empty sea, our hearts pounding in our chests. But the worst part? The thing that makes my skin crawl even now as I write this? When we finally got the engine working and headed back to shore, I felt something heavy in my pocket. I reached in, my fingers brushing against something cold, something metal, a gold coin. But when I pulled it out, it wasn't gold at all. It was bone. A small, intricately carved piece of bone with a symbol etched into it. A skull. And when I looked up at my reflection in the cabin window, I swear I saw a pair of hollow eyes staring back at me from the dark. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The ride back to shore was dead silent. Brian kept his hands clenched around the wheel, staring straight ahead, his knuckles white against the darkness. Max, usually the loudest of us, was quiet, too quiet. His face was pale, eyes wide, like he was reliving what we'd just seen over and over in his mind. And Cole hadn't said a word since I nearly got strangled by a skeleton. But I couldn't stop thinking about that coin. That Bona coin. It felt heavier than it should, like it was pulling me down into something far worse than what we'd already faced. I kept it clenched in my fist, feeling the sharp ridges of the carving digging into my palm, a reminder that this was real. Too real. We docked around midnight. The fog hung low over the marina, muffling the usual sounds of the harbor. No water lapping against the boats, no night birds calling from the cliffs. It was like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something worse to happen. Brian was the first off the boat. "We're done," he muttered under his breath. "Forget the treasure, forget the ship. We're not talking about this ever again." None of us argued. Who would? We packed up our gear in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I could still feel that cold touch on my skin, the grip of those skeletal fingers, the way its hollow eyes had bored into mine as if seeing straight through me. But as I started to leave, something caught my eye. The boat. There were footprints on the deck. Bony, skeletal footprints smeared across the wood in a thin layer of something dark, too dark to be just dirt. Blood? It wasn't mine, wasn't anyone's. I would have noticed if one of us had bled like that. No, this was something else. Something not of this world. "Hey!" I called to the others, my voice shaky. "Come take a look at this." Brian turned, his expression twisted in frustration. "What now?" I pointed at the footprints. "We didn't leave those." Cole stepped closer, his face contorting as he stared at the dark stains. That wasn't there before. Max, who had been standing by the truck, rushed over, his eyes darting between us. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I admitted, though I had a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. But we weren't alone. There was a moment of dead silence before Brian let out a harsh laugh, the kind that sounded more like he was trying to convince himself than us. "You're just seeing things. We're all rattled, okay? Let's just get the hell out of here." I nodded, not wanting to push it further. But as we walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The air around me felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. Each step away from the boat felt like pulling against some unseen force, like the dock itself was trying to keep us tethered there, trapped. By the time we reached the truck, we were all on edge, snapping at each other over nothing. Max couldn't find his keys, Brian's lighter wouldn't work, and Cole kept glancing over his shoulder as if he could feel eyes on him too. Finally, we all piled into the truck and Brian gunned the engine. The wheels screeched against the gravel as we sped down the narrow road, leaving the marina and the Revenant behind. But as the lights of the marina faded into the distance, the temperature in the truck dropped. It was subtle at first, a cool draft slipping through the cracked windows, but then it got colder and colder. Our breath came out in white clouds, and frost began to spread across the inside of the windshield. "What the hell?" Max said, his voice shaking as he rubbed his hands together. "Why is it so cold?" "I don't know," Brian snapped, fiddling with the heat. "This thing's acting up, it's—" Then we heard it. A thud, heavy, like something had landed on the roof of the truck. The sound echoed in the cab, sending a shockwave of silence through all of us. We all froze. I could hear my heart hammering in my chest, could feel my pulse in my throat. I slowly turned my head to look at the others, and their expressions were mirrors of my own. Fear, pure and raw, etched on every face. Then came another thud, this one louder, followed by a slow, deliberate scraping soul sound. Metal against metal, like something was dragging itself across the roof of the truck. Brian slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt in the middle of the dark road. We sat in silence, waiting, listening to the sound of whatever was up there, moving, shifting, dragging itself closer to the edge. Without thinking, I grabbed the door handle, heart racing. "We have to get out of here." "No," Brian hissed, his voice barely a whisper. "Don't move! Don't!" The roof dit caved in with a loud crash, the metal folding under the weight of something massive. We screamed. The whole truck shook violently as if it was being rocked by an earthquake. And then I saw it. Just a glimpse in the rearview mirror. White, gleaming bone against the black night. It was a skeleton. Crawling down the windshield, its hollow eyes fixed on me. Then it reached for the door handle. I barely had time to react before it yanked the door open, its bony fingers wrapping around my arm with impossible strength. I screamed as it pulled me out of the truck and threw me onto the cold asphalt. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The thing stood before me, towering, its skull glinting in the moonlight. And then it smiled, a horrible wide smile of jagged bone that chilled me to my core. "You've taken what's ours," it rasped, the voice a cold wind that seemed to cut through the night. "Now we'll take you." I turned to run, but something cold wrapped around my ankle, yanking me back. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me, but I kept clawing at the road, desperate to escape. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the Revenant, its black sails billowing on the horizon and the sound of laughter. Hollow, echoing, bone-chilling laughter that followed me into the dark. I woke up with the taste of blood in my mouth and the sound of waves crashing against wood. The world came into focus slowly, like surfacing from a nightmare. Except this wasn't a dream. I was on a ship, the Revenant. The fog was thick, clinging to the rotted timbers of the deck, swirling in strange patterns as the ship cut through the water. I tried to move, but something held me in place. My wrists and ankles were bound with thick, slimy ropes, the coarse fibers biting into my skin. The wood beneath me creaked as the ship rocked, and the air reeked of salt and rot, as though death itself had settled into every crevice. I struggled against my restraints, heart pounding. The others, where were they? "Brian?" I croaked, my voice hoarse. "Cole? Max?" No answer. Just the groaning of the ship and the endless wash of the waves against the hull. But as I twisted my neck, I caught sight of something. Movement. They were here. Max was slumped against a mast, his body limp and battered, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Cole lay face down near the rail, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle. But there was no sign of Brian. I called their names again, but nothing stirred. They were either unconscious or worse. And then I heard the clatter of the bones. The sound sent a chill down my spine. It came from somewhere above, a steady, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. Slowly I turned my head toward the source, and there they were. The crew. They were scattered across the deck, moving with unnatural precision, their empty eye sockets glowing faintly in the fog. Some wore tattered remnants of old pirate coats, others nothing but scraps of leather and rusted chains. Their bodies were nothing more than skeletons, yet they moved with a terrifying grace, their bones clicking and creaking with every step. And then one of them turned to me. It stood at the helm, its bony fingers wrapped around the wheel, steering the ship through the mist. Its skull was cracked and weathered, a black bandana tied around its hollow forehead. When its empty gaze locked onto mine, it tilted its head, and I could feel it was smiling. "We're not dead yet," I whispered to myself, trying to keep the panic at bay. But it was useless. The fear was crawling up my throat like bile. The skeleton at the helm raised one hand, and the others turned in unison, their hollow eyes all fixated on me. There was no sound, no growl, no whisper, just the eerie silence of the dead watching the living. I yanked harder against the ropes, feeling them cut deeper into my skin. I had to get free. I had to wake Max, Cole, someone. I couldn't stay here. Not with them all. Suddenly, there was a crack! A loud, splintering noise from behind me. I craned my neck, heart hammering, and saw the hatch to the lower deck slowly creak open. The fog swirled, thick and ominous, as something began to rise from below. A hand. Not bone. Flesh. It was dark and wet. Fingers splayed wide as they gripped the edge of the hatch. And then, slowly, a body followed. It was dressed in the same rotting pirate garb as the skeletons, but this one was different. It wasn't a skeleton, not yet. Its flesh was decayed, bloated with water, hanging from its bones in ragged strips. The stench hit me before I even saw its face, a wave of rot and death so overpowering I gagged. The thing clambered onto the deck, dragging itself toward me with jerking, unnatural movements, as though it hadn't used its limbs in centuries. Its head lolled to one side, and when its eyes finally found mine, I wished they hadn't. They were black pits, endless voids of hatred and hunger, sunken deep into a face that had been human once, long ago. It stopped inches from me, its ragged breath rasping in and out like wind through a broken window. Its fingers, still half covered in rotting flesh, reached for my face. "Stay away!" I screamed, thrashing against the ropes, but it was useless. The thing's hand closed around my throat, its touch ice cold. I could feel its bony fingers beneath the rotting flesh digging into my skin, pressing down. "You've disturbed our rest," it rasped, the voice low and hollow like a wind blowing through an empty grave. "You've taken what belongs to us." I struggled for air, vision blurring at the edges. Its grip tightened, and I could feel myself slipping, sinking into the blackness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure released. I gasped, coughing violently as the thing let go and stepped back. But it didn't retreat. It just stared at me, that hateful gaze burning into my soul. "Look around," it whispered. I did. That's when I noticed it. The bush gold. It was everywhere. Piles of it. Coins, goblets, jewels, scattered across the deck, glinting in the weak moonlight. And at the center of it all, a chest. A massive iron-bound chest, its lid slightly ajar, revealing the treasure within. The treasure we'd been after. But something was wrong. The gold wasn't gleaming. It wasn't bright. It was dark. Almost black, like it had been stained with something far more sinister than time. And the air around it, it felt alive, pulsing, humming with a strange, malevolent energy. The thing that had grabbed me, whatever it was, slowly raised its hand, pointing at the chest. "That," it said, its voice barely above a whisper, "is what you've awakened." I stared at the chest, heart pounding, and something moved inside it. A faint shifting, like something alive, something waiting. And then it both spoke. Not in words, not in any language I could understand. But I felt it deep in my bones, a low guttural growl that sent a shiver through my entire body. Something inside that chest wanted out. I turned to Max and Cole, but they were still unconscious, or dead. I couldn't tell. My vision was starting to blur again, and I felt a strange, cold numbness creeping up my legs. I looked down and saw with horror that the ropes weren't just holding me, they were changing me. My skin was pale, my veins darkening, turning black as the cursed gold. "Help!" I whispered, but there was no one to hear me. Not anyone living. The crew, the chained skeleton crew, stood silently around the deck, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They weren't going to stop this. They were going to let it happen. And as the darkness crawled higher, as the numbness spread through my chest, I realized the truth. This wasn't just about the treasure. This was about the curse. And now it had claimed me. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the chest creaking open, the fog swirling inside, and the faint sound of something laughing. Not from the skeletons, not from the thing that had grabbed me, but from inside the chest. It wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. When I came to, I was still on the deck of the Revenant, but something had changed. The thick fog that had choked the air moments before was beginning to thin, allowing slivers of moonlight to break through. I blinked hard, trying to shake the darkness from my mind, but the image of the chest, a cursed, writhing thing, still burned in my vision. I could move again. The ropes that had bound me, the ones that had begun to change me, were gone. In their place, I found nothing but pale marks on my wrists and ankles, like scars from a nightmare that had come too close to being real. I sat up slowly, every muscle in my body screaming in protest, and that's when I saw them. Max, Cole, and Brian. They were alive, just barely, but alive nonetheless. Max was groaning, his head resting on the mast, and Cole was coughing, his twisted arm looking more like a sprain than the deathly break I'd feared. Brian was slumped near the rail, his face pale but breathing steadily. "Max!" I called out, my voice hoarse. "Cole!" Max stirred, groaning as he opened his eyes. What happened?" "You're okay," I said, relief flooding through me like a tidal wave. "We're all okay. Somehow we're still alive." But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't out of this yet. Not by a long shot. The crew, the skeletal crew, was still there, watching us in silence. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, and their bony fingers twitched as if they were waiting for something, though they didn't move toward us. I scrambled to my feet, helping Max and Cole to theirs, and we slowly made our way toward Brian, who was starting to come around. What is this place?" Brian muttered, blinking up at me. "The ship," I said, my voice shaky. "We're on the Revenant." He nodded slowly, as if trying to process everything, but his eyes quickly darted to the chest. "The treasure? We found it." I glanced at the chest, still slightly ajar, and felt a shudder run through me. The malevolent energy that had once pulsed from it seemed to have dimmed, but I knew better than to trust it. There was something inside that chest, something that wasn't gold, something that wasn't meant to be found. "We need to get off this ship," Cole said, his voice weak but determined. "Now!" Max nodded, but Brian didn't move. His eyes were locked on the chest. "But what about—" "Forget the gold," I snapped, my voice harsher than I intended. "It's cursed. We need to leave before whatever's in there comes for us again." Brian hesitated, his gaze flicking between the chest and the crew of skeletons still watching us. But then, as if he finally understood the weight of the situation, he nodded. "Let's go." We stumbled toward the edge of the deck, our legs barely holding us up when the air shifted. The ship creaked loudly, and the fog, which had been thinning, suddenly surged forward, swirling around us like a living thing. The skeletons turned their hollow gazes to us, and the temperature dropped again, sending a cold shock through my bones. And then the chest groaned. I turned slowly, my heart racing, and saw the lid of the chest slowly rise on its rusty hinges. Dark mist swirled from inside, curling upward like smoke, and from within the chest a soft, eerie glow began to form. "Run!" I shouted, but the fog pressed in around us, thick and suffocating. A voice echoed from the chest. Not the guttural growl from before, but something softer, more human. "You took what was ours, and now we reclaim it." The skeletal crew moved then, but not toward us. They turned to the chest, their bony hands outstretched as if in prayer or worship. The glow grew brighter, and the mist became a vortex, spinning faster and faster, pulling at everything. Us, the ship, the cursed treasure itself. I grabbed hold of the railing, feeling the pull of the vortex like a current dragging me under. Brian, Max, and Cole did the same, our bodies fighting against the force that seemed ready to consume us. The crew, however, seemed at peace, their skeletal forms dissolving into the mist, disappearing into the chest one by one. Their hollow eyes closed in what almost looked like relief, as if they were finally being freed from centuries of torment. And then the chest began to close. With a final deafening snap, the lid slammed shut and the vortex vanished. The fog lifted, the glow faded, and the ship was still. For a long, breathless moment, none of us moved. We were alive. The curse, whatever it had been, was over. I looked at the chest, now just a lifeless, iron-bound box. The treasure inside wasn't what we thought. It had been a prison for the souls of the damned. And now they were gone, finally at peace. The crew was gone, too. The ship, though ancient and creaking, felt empty. Brian was the first to speak, his voice quiet. "We're free." I nodded. "Yeah, we're free." Max let out a shaky laugh, his eyes wide with disbelief. "We made it." Cole grinned weakly, clutching his arm. "Never doing this again." We gathered ourselves, finding the strength to move. The dinghy we had used to get to the ship was still tied off to the side, bobbing gently in the now calm waters. We climbed in, one by one, and began rowing away from the Revenant. As the ship faded into the distance, swallowed by the thinning mist, I let out a long, slow breath. We had escaped. We had survived the cursed treasure, the undead crew, and whatever horror had been locked in that chest. And for the first time since we had set out on this insane journey, I allowed myself to believe that it was really over. We were going home. As the shore came into view, bathed in the soft glow of dawn, I looked back one last time at the horizon, where the Revenant had been. It was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there at all. Maybe, just maybe, the souls of the cursed pirates had finally found their rest. And as we reached the shore, the first light of the new day warming our faces, I realized something that made me smile. We had survived the skeleton crew.